Welcome back to the Lab of Doom, amateur genealogy series. As I mentioned last time, I wanted to get into the backstory of Mina Ross, because her tale is an interesting bit of Americana and Wild West rolled into one. So the story goes that W.C. Ross's wife, Ans Chiss of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe, dies, leaving him with 2 young children, so Ans Chiss's best friend, Mina Ashford, steps in to help raise the kids, and the couple eventually get married. Of course, as I pointed out last time, if we look at the dates, Mina was pregnant before Ans Chiss's grave was cold, but this isn't half of it. If you don't mind, let me build an interesting case of wild supposition for you guys. I suppose to get to know Mina, maybe we need to know a little bit about her parents, Martin Schoonover and Frances Taylor. Frances was a respectable descendant of a Mayflower passenger and families that had been long established in the Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York areas by that time in America. Martin, on the other hand, technically hailed from the Schoonover family, who were an established Dutch family in New York, but it turns out he wasn't biologically theirs. If we look at Martin's records, they all say he was born at sea, long after the Schoonovers crossed the Atlantic. From a private letter, this is what his daughter understood to be the story. Well, Pa was said to have been born on the Atlantic Ocean, March 20th, 1836. He crossed that twice. He was supposed to have been born on the Atlantic Ocean to a French mother who left him a sick baby with the Schoonover family, while she, the French mother, was called back across the ocean. When she sent for this boy later, she was informed that he had died. She was married to an Englishman. His name was Oliver. When Pa was 21, he left the Schoonovers who had raised him, and he hunted the Olivers up. They thought first he was an imposter. However, he had a peculiar birthmark, the birthmark of the Olivers, so finally they believed him and took him in. But they were wine merchants and had an older son, who in England rules. Anyway, Pa didn't like the liquor business, so he crossed back over to New York and married and settled down there. That birthmark was a round white hair on the back of his head among the dark brown. He had that all his life. Of course, Mother Schoonover said he was as much hers as any of the others, but Pa said he had often wondered why the old man Schoonover gave the others good schooling, clothes, and money, and was so close with him. And another thing, him and Louisa were the same age but not twins. Louisa was a Schoonover girl who later rooked Pa out of his dead wife's rings and brooches and trinkets. Maybe Pa took the place of a dead twin. Well, I guess you had heard this before, so I hope it's not a shock. I think Mother Schoonover was good to Pa, but the old man Schoonover used to go on terrific drunks once a year and would light his pipe with a rolled up $500 bill. Some old gent, eh? Well, Pa couldn't stand that, so he got out and done for himself after he was 21. Glad he was able to. There's a lot going on here. The Schoonovers took in the Oliver's baby as their own, as a favor, and when it was time to give him back, the Schoonovers told the parents that the baby died, so they could keep him. That is pretty messed up right there. I guess back then, what could you do a world away and an ocean apart? It seems that as slow as transatlantic communications were, to do investigations and court proceedings over the ocean seems like an insurmountable task. Unfortunately, as is sometimes the case with adopted children, there is some turmoil and conflict that goes along with the feeling of not belonging that can occur, and Martin seemed to be not immune to such things. He didn't get along with his adopted father and struggled with his Schoonover identity. At times in his life, this can be seen in documents where he lists himself by his birth name, Martin Oliver, instead of Schoonover, like on the 1880 census where he lists the whole family under the Oliver name. Do I think old man Schoonover lit up $500 bills to smoke? No way that is anything but hyperbole, but it does sound like Martin felt he was getting short shrift in the Schoonover household, whether he deserved it or not. Either way, Martin came back to New York, married his first wife at 24, Mary Catlin, with whom they had 2 children near the Schoonover home in Owego, New York. Mary died in 1863, shortly after the birth of her second child. This was the wife whose jewelry his sister Louisa supposedly grabbed from him. Martin proceeded to wed Mary's cousin, Frances Taylor, a year later. Considering the quick marriage, maybe the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, but at least Martin and Frances's first child, Mina Schoonover, was born 2 years later in 1866, just over the border in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. This was the same Mina that later would marry W.C. Ross. When Mina was 4, Martin moved the family from Bradford, where he was running 2 sawmills, back to a farm near Owego, New York. In the summer of 1876, by the time Mina was 11, Martin had uprooted again and took the now large family on a 7-week journey to a spot 12 miles northwest of Caldwell, Kansas. They traveled in a specially rebuilt hack with a team of Arabian horses and all their belongings. They used the windows from the hack in their sod house. Martin's daughter, Mary, died died there in 1877, a year later. After 5 years of drought and grasshoppers in Caldwell, Martin trekked closer to the Oklahoma border and established himself in Kiowa, Kansas. He continued farming while he was trekking freight between Wichita and Caldwell to Darlington and Fort Sill in Oklahoma. We don't know much about Mina's childhood years, but we do know she learned to read and write based on what is recorded in the 1880 census. Also, it is said that she worked out, meaning she did odd jobs for other households as a means of earning money. This included houses short on help, even Native American families apparently. At the age of 17, Mina married Levi Sidney Barrett in Kiowa, Kansas. In 1885, a year later, they had a daughter named Mary. Here's a reproduction of a tintype taken in Caldwell, Kansas, late fall of 1883 that comes with a letter and a story. Here we have Mina Schoonover Barrett, top left, Annie Bird Stevenson, top right, Levi Sid Barrett, bottom left, and Richard Eugene Schoonover, bottom right. Well, Sid was red-headed and freckle-faced, slim and quite tall. I think he was the same height as Rich, 5 feet 10 inches. He was a good-natured guy. I never knew of him and your mother ever having any trouble. Sure was a surprise when he left like he did. I'm not sure, but I think him and Granddaddy Schoonover had some trouble. They lived in Barber County. Rich and I were in Sumner County at my father's. That is, we lived in Pap's little house. Sid came down there and stayed several days with us. Him and Rich traded horses, and he sold us his small wagon. He said they didn't have any money. One morning, he got up and said he guessed he'd better go home. Mina would be uneasy about him. We had a red blanket he wanted, so we gave it to him. He tied it behind his saddle, and he left the wagon with us. And we supposed he had gone home, till several days later, we got a letter from your mother wanting to know if we had seen Sid. Then we got another letter from Granddaddy Schoonover. That's the last we ever saw or heard of Sid. Rich freighted down into the territory back then, and he kept watch out for Sid, but never did see him. Oh, he was pleasant enough to talk to, and I don't think I ever seen him mad, and he seemed to think the world of your mother and baby, little Mary. We all liked Sid, that is, Rich and I and my folks. Sure was a shocking surprise to us all that none of them could find any trace of him. So a new father up and vanished without a trace out in the Old West. Well, there are deadbeat dads out there, that is for sure, but this might not be exactly the case. There's no supporting evidence I can find of a grave or documentation I can find showing that Sid moved on or even died. Now, at this point, if you haven't picked up on it yet, I may want to let you know that Martin Van Buren Schoonover's nickname in some circles is Crazy Martin. Martin apparently had a little trouble getting along with some folks, including his father. Sometimes on the frontier, you can settle in court, like this suit against Martin by a Lee Darrow. Of course, if it's a more heated or personal matter, maybe frontier justice comes into play. It reminds me a little bit of the book The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where they live in a state of self-governing anarchy, and the best thing to do in most situations is to be easy to get along with, to not become a problem, or you end up being fertilizer. You see, it is the family story that Martin actually wasn't too fond of old Ginger Sid. The word is Sid caught a sudden case of lead poisoning from his father-in-law after he had ticked off old Crazy Martin, and nobody found the body out on that vast prairie. If we go back to the story, Sid went to a friend's house after a fight. We know Sid had his own land according to this declaration of settlement, so Sid and Mina probably weren't living with Martin at the time. The obvious conclusion is that Sid had a big fight with Mina about what we don't know, but big enough that you hide from a new mother for a few days. When he comes back home, someone not too happy was waiting for him. I can only conclude it was either Mina or Martin acting on Mina's behalf. There was no mention of him in any newspaper that I found, in spite of the fact that a lot of those frontier newspapers would find even the smallest happening newsworthy, so I am a little surprised that a search for a new father didn't make the news. Outside of Mina and daughter, it appears that Sid, born in Indian territory, didn't have any local relatives. My guess is that, in spite of the letters, nobody was actually looking for Sid, and nobody was going to report him missing to anyone. Snitches get stitches, y'all, and those pioneer farmers sure did have a lot of acreage to cover. I'm not saying he was murdered, but signs indicate he had a premature demise. Mina's obituary flat out states Sid was killed. According to the internet, Sid died in June 1885 at Old Drum Ranch, Kansas, less than 3 months after his daughter Mary was born. 4 years later, in early 1889, Mina marries a Texan named George Ashford at the age of 22. That's right, Mina Schoonover, who became Mina Barrett in her first marriage, was now the Mina Ashford that we saw on WC's marriage certificate. That doesn't spell good things for old George. We'll get into that in a minute. 4 months after the marriage, a pregnant Mina participated in the Oklahoma land rush on horseback. From all accounts, it was Martin and Mina who took part of the Oklahoma land run of 1889, with Martin staking claim on land in Grady County, Oklahoma, in the middle of the state on the Canadian River. The farm is apparently still there. Maybe I'll visit it one day. Mina staked out an adjacent claim, but she seemed to have lost her claim due to a filing or clerical paperwork error. Now, I'm not saying that George screwed this up or dropped the ball in some way, but there is probably a reason his participation is written out or not mentioned. Either he didn't participate, he didn't do the work, or he was the one who made the filing error. The last census I could find him in indicates he was unable to read or write at the age of 12, so maybe he wasn't exactly the type you should depend on to do paperwork. That's all I'm saying. Either way, Mina lost her claim, and she was now in Oklahoma, still living with her father while working out and taking care of eventually 3 children. According to her obituary, she cut cedar posts for her father and worked odd jobs around the El Reno area during this time. Presumably, George was helping her father as well, but apparently George had no land to speak of, and so the couple weren't out living on their own. This is about the time, through her side job, that Mina probably met William Carter Ross, Anschutz, and the family. Life on the frontier couldn't have been easy for 25-year-old Mina, especially in 1892 when she was suddenly surrounded by death. Her husband and children all died. W.C. Ross's 2 oldest children died that year as well. One can only guess a terrible plague had swept through the area. A couple years later, Anschutz died from illness as well. Now, a 2-time widow in her 20s, we could assume that Mina was just down on her luck and feeling sorry for herself in a world of harsh realities and hard knocks. You wouldn't blame her if she was feeling that way anyhow. She is easily pitiable on the face of the story of her young adult life. Well, let's just read what she had to say about herself in The Indian's Last Stand, or The Dull Knife Raid, as the wife of the late George Ashford, at the end of a chapter where she related to the author in some detail the Native American Sundance ritual. I feel very much indebted for the above description of the Sundance to a lady who spent many of her younger years with the tribe who conducted it. She is familiar with the customs of the tribe, knows their traditions, and in fact may be considered an authority on things related to the history of that nation. Her name at the time of which I write was Mina E. Ashford, but was changed by the Indians to Tatavo-i-Tau, or blue beads, on account of the string of blue beads which she usually wore around her neck. She was loved and admired by the whole tribe, but particularly by several young chiefs who sought her hand in marriage. Her affections, however, leaned to another direction, and afterwards she married W.C. Ross, who owns a large tract of land adjoining the flourishing city of El Reno, the Queen City of the North Canadian. Mrs. Ross is today the mother of a large family of sons and daughters who are a credit to her and an honor to the state of Oklahoma. Even today, she delights in telling how she used to enjoy riding out on a bronco, lassoing a wild antelope or deer, and dragging it back to camp amid the cheers and acclamations of the whole tribe. Well, it sounds like Mina was quite the epitome of Wild West folklore. It is hard to say how much of an actual expert Mina really was on the Cheyenne. From what little I have read in the rest of the book, it takes a pretty favorable and open, if still antiquated, outsider view of Native Americans. Presumably, by living so close to Indian territory and working out for Native and pioneer families alike, Mina probably had some familiarity with the local tribes from the proximity alone. Her obituary says she could speak the Cheyenne language. If so, she would have likely had spent a huge amount of time with them. The few pictures I have of the young Mina do appear to show her wearing outfits that seem to favor a more native than European settler stylings, at least to my untrained eye. And let's not forget that Mina was supposed to be best friends with Anschutz, so maybe she was spending a lot of time with the tribe as opposed to Crazy Martin. About that best friend though. Okay, sure, entirely possible they were best friends, but then we get to the next sentence and it makes me wonder. All these guys, chiefs even, had a soft spot for Mina, but she was holding out for W.C. Ross? Even when it was the case that both of them were married? How incredibly convenient that everybody that stood in the way of their union died abruptly, and she gets pregnant within weeks of Anschutz's death and months before she even gets married. There certainly was no time for courtship in that timeline, so if this union wasn't in the back of her mind, it didn't take much persuasion. I'm not saying that Mina was a Black Widow type, but remember Mina's first husband, Sid Never Seen Again Barrett? Makes you think, doesn't it? Sure, there may not have been any life insurance to collect back in those days, but it doesn't help that hapless George was being compared to W.C. Ross, a guy that, as we discussed in the last video, can easily be described as a go-getter. Being married to a go-getter in the frontier was life insurance of its own back then. Remember that one thing that Sid emphasized before his disappearance was that he was broke. One could imagine thinking of W.C.'s children living, quote, beyond want, while you were breaking your back splitting timber for your father to make ends meet, and maybe feeling a little envious. The state of Oklahoma didn't begin filing a lot of records until 1908, and it was not required by law to file birth or death records until 1917. As you can imagine, this makes Oklahoma a bit of a black hole for records for that time period. Kansas wasn't much better, as can be observed when you try to find out more about Sid's mysterious disappearance. George and the children's sudden demise would have gotten my theoretical newspaper's attention, but actual newspapers, it was a different story. People apparently died and went missing by the bucket back then, and no more can be found about it. Is it possible that this happily ever after story story between Mina and William Carter Ross was much darker than we ever thought? Sure, the most likely answer is rampant illness, but there's also the possibility, in my wild imagination, of someone not stopping at a single murder as well. We'll probably never know, though. Martin Van Buren Schoonover died in Boise, Idaho in 1910 because he got itchy feet again and moved across the country, as is his pattern. Mina and W.C. Ross went on to have a large family together, and Mina lived a long and happy life until she died at the age of 88 in 1954 on the farm where her and W.C. were married. Anyhow, I thought that was something interesting to share and hope that you found it interesting too, conspiracy theories and all. If you liked this video and would like more, please like and subscribe. Until next time, be kind to one another.